They said she couldn't stand anymore, and in a town like Dry Creek, that was the same as saying she didn't matter, because out here, if no one stands with you, you disappear before sundown. And that morning the wind carried dust low across the street, slipping under boots and through the cracks of every wooden storefront, while a circle of silence formed where people pretended not to see too much. And in the center of it all was a woman with dark hair tangled by travel and eyes that refused to close even when the ground seemed closer than the sky, her breathing steady in a way that didn't match the moment, like she had already decided something no one else understood. And a few feet away, half buried in the dirt, lay a small silver pendant, simple at first glance, but catching the light just enough to feel like it didn't belong to this place. And at the edge of the street stood Elias Boone, one hand resting loosely near his belt, not on his gun, just there out of habit, his posture still, almost disconnected, like a man who had learned long ago that stepping into other people's trouble usually came with a cost. And for a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak, just watched the way the crowd shifted its weight, the way the sheriff avoided looking too closely, the way the woman's fingers pressed into the dust, as if the earth itself might answer her if she asked quietly enough. And then the wind turned slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of dry sage and leather. And something in that scent reached back 10 years into a memory Elias had buried beneath miles of road and years of silence. A memory of heat and thirst, and a pair of steady hands offering water without question, without fear. And his eyes dropped to the pendant again, studying the worn edges, the way the chain had been repaired more than once, and the world around him seemed to narrow, the voices fading into something distant and unimportant. Because out here, the truth didn't always come from what people said. It came from the things they carried, the things they refused to let go. And the woman's hand moved, just slightly, brushing against the pendant as if even now she was trying to keep it close. And that was when Elias exhaled, slow and quiet, like a man finally reaching the end of an argument he'd been having with himself. And he stepped forward, one measured step at a time, boots pressing into the same dust that had swallowed so many other stories, until he crossed that invisible line the rest of the town wouldn't dare approach. And though no one spoke, every eye followed him, because something had shifted, something they couldn't name but could feel settling into the space between them. And Elias bent down without hurry, his shadow falling across the silver pendant as he reached for it, lifting it from the dirt with a care that didn't match the roughness of the street. And for the first time, the woman looked up at him, not with fear, not with gratitude, but with a quiet recognition that made the air feel heavier. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, before anyone understood what was about to change, the entire town held its breath without knowing why. The pendant felt warmer than it should have in Elias Boone's hand, as if it had been waiting to be found. And for a moment he did not move, not because he feared the eyes on him, but because the memory pressing against his chest refused to stay quiet any longer. And the sound of Dry Creek faded into something distant, replaced by wind across open desert, and a voice he had not heard in years, soft and steady, telling him to drink when he had been too stubborn to admit he was close to dying. And now that same quiet strength stood in front of him again, though the years had carved new lines into her face, and the world had clearly not been kind. And still she held herself with a dignity that did not belong to this place. And as Elias straightened slowly, the silver chain resting across his fingers, Sheriff Doyle Mercer finally stepped forward, boots measured, voice low but firm enough for the crowd to hear, asking if there was a reason the cowboy had decided to involve himself in matters that did not concern him. And Elias did not answer right away, because out here words had a way of making things smaller than they really were, and this was not small, not to him, not anymore. And instead he looked down at the woman, meeting her gaze fully now. And there it was again, that flicker of recognition, not surprise, not fear, but something deeper, something that said she knew exactly who he was even if she had not spoken his name. And behind them the crowd shifted uneasily, the kind of movement that came when certainty started to crack, when people realized the story they had accepted might not be as simple as they wanted it to be. And a man near the edge muttered something about keeping order, about not letting outsiders change the way things were done in Dry Creek. But even his voice lacked conviction, because Elias Boone did not look like a man who came to change things. He looked like a man who had already decided something and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up, and the woman's hand moved again, brushing against his wrist this time, light but deliberate. And when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet strength of someone who had endured more than this moment alone, telling him in careful English that he should not stand here for her, that this town would not understand and would not forget. And Elias let out a slow breath, almost a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth, because he had heard that warning before, in different words, in different places, and it had never changed what needed to be done. And without looking away from her, he lifted the pendant slightly, letting the sunlight catch it once more, and asked her where she had found it, though part of him already knew the answer. And she held his gaze for a long second before replying that it had been given to her family long ago, passed down as a reminder that kindness travels farther than fear. And something in those words settled the last doubt in his mind, because there are moments in a man's life when the past does not stay buried. It walks back into the present and demands to be recognized, and Elias Boone had just reached that moment. And when he finally turned his head toward the sheriff and the watching crowd, his eyes carried none of the hesitation they had seen before, only a quiet certainty that did not need to be spoken aloud, and that was when the weight in the air shifted again, heavier now, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon, waiting for the first sign that it was time to break. No one moved. Not even the wind seemed willing to cross that space now. And Sheriff Doyle Mercer studied Elias Boone with the careful patience of a man who understood that control could slip away without warning if he chose the wrong words. And for a long second, he said nothing, letting the silence stretch, hoping it might pull Elias back to the edge where men usually returned when things became uncomfortable. But Elias did not step back, did not shift his weight. He simply stood there with the pendant resting against the woman's collarbone, as if it had always belonged there. And that quiet certainty unsettled more than any raised voice ever could. And somewhere behind the sheriff a chair scraped against wood, a small sound, but sharp enough to draw attention. And a young boy stepped forward, no more than 12, his hat clutched too tightly in his hands, his eyes fixed on the ground, as if looking up might change something he was not ready to face. And the crowd parted just enough to let him through, not because they wanted to hear him, but because uncertainty had already begun to open cracks in their confidence. And the boy stopped a few feet away, his breathing uneven, and for a moment it seemed like he might turn back, might disappear into the safety of silence like so many others had before him. But then his gaze lifted just slightly, catching the glint of the silver pendant, and something in his expression shifted, something closer to recognition than fear, and his voice came out small but clear enough to carry, saying that the horse everyone had been talking about had not been taken the way they thought, that his father had made a deal weeks ago, quiet and hidden, and had not told anyone because it would have cost him standing in the town. And the words landed heavy, heavier than any accusation had before, because truth, when it finally arrives, does not shout, it settles. And the sheriff's jaw tightened as he turned toward the boy, weighing the cost of letting those words exist in the open. And the men who had been so certain minutes ago shifted again, their confidence draining in slow, uncomfortable steps. And the woman beside Elias did not speak, did not move much at all, but her shoulders lifted slightly, as if something unseen had been taken off them. And Elias watched the boy carefully, not with suspicion, but with the quiet understanding of someone who knew how difficult it was to stand in front of people who expected you to stay silent. And when the boy finished, the street felt different, not calmer, but clearer, like the dust had finally settled enough to show what had been there all along. And Sheriff Mercer let out a slow breath, adjusting his stance as if trying to reclaim ground that no longer belonged to him. And he asked the boy to repeat himself, louder this time, for everyone to hear. But the boy did not need to be asked twice, because once a truth finds its voice, it does not easily return to silence. And as the words echoed again, more certain now, the crowd could no longer pretend they did not understand. And still Elias Boone said nothing, because he did not need to. He simply rested his hand steady at the woman's back, not holding her up, just there, a presence, a reminder. And when she finally drew in a deeper breath and straightened another inch on her own, it was not the town that gave her that strength. It was the simple fact that someone had chosen not to walk away. And in that moment, Without a single shot fired or command given, the balance of the entire street shifted, and everyone there knew it. Even if none of them were ready to admit what it meant, the truth did not bring relief the way people liked to imagine. It did not wash over the street like clean rain or lift the weight from every shoulder. It settled instead, heavy and uneven, pressing into each person differently, and Sheriff Doyle Mercer knew it the moment the boy finished speaking, because the power he had held just minutes ago no longer rested in his hands. It hovered uncertainly in the space between him and the crowd, waiting to see who would claim it next, and for a long moment he said nothing, his eyes moving from the boy to the men behind him and, finally, to Elias Boone, who still stood unmoved, his hand steady at the woman's back, not guiding her, not forcing her, simply there. And that was what unsettled the sheriff the most, not defiance, not anger, but the absence of both, because men who shouted could be challenged, men who threatened could be answered, but a man who simply stood his ground without needing to prove anything was harder to confront, and the crowd felt it too. Their earlier certainty now replaced by quiet calculation. Glances exchanged in low movements, boots shifting against the dust as if each person was trying to decide which side of the moment they belonged to. And the woman beside Elias drew in another breath, slower this time, more controlled, and her shoulders straightened another inch, not because anyone told her to, but because the weight pressing down on her had changed, and she no longer carried it alone. And the pendant at her throat caught the light again. A small thing, easily overlooked, but in that moment it held more meaning than any words spoken in the street. And Elias finally lifted his gaze fully to the sheriff, his voice calm when it came, not loud, not demanding, simply stating what had already become clear, that there was nothing left to decide here, that the truth had already done its work. And Sheriff Mercer exhaled slowly, a man measuring the cost of holding on versus letting go. And when he spoke, his tone had changed, the sharp edge gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to acceptance than authority, as he told the crowd that the matter was settled, that there would be no further action taken, and the words landed differently than before, not as an order, but as a release, and one by one the tension in the street began to loosen, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small ways, a man stepping back, another lowering his gaze. A woman turning toward the storefront as if remembering something she needed to do, and the crowd that had gathered so tightly began to thin, not because they were told to leave, but because there was no longer anything left for them to hold on to. And still Elias Boone did not move right away, did not rush the moment or claim any victory. He simply stood there until the noise of the town returned to something normal, until the space around them no longer felt like a stage. And only then did he lower his hand from the woman's back, not pulling away completely, just giving her the room to choose her own balance. And she remained standing, not perfectly steady, not untouched by what had come before, but upright, fully present. Her gaze moving across the street, not with anger, not with fear, but with a quiet understanding that seemed to reach beyond this place. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried that same calm strength, telling Elias that he had stepped into something that would not end here, that Dry Creek was only a small piece of a much larger story. And Elias met her eyes without hesitation, because he already knew that, had known at the moment he saw the pendant in the dust, and somewhere beyond the edge of town, where the horizon stretched wide and unforgiving, something unseen had already begun to move, something that would not be settled by a single moment of truth. And as the last of the crowd drifted away, leaving only the echo of what had almost happened behind them, the real weight of what was coming next settled quietly into the space they now stood in together. The street did not return to normal the way people liked to pretend it could, not right away, because something had been seen, something had been felt. And once that kind of truth settles into a place like Dry Creek, it lingers in the boards of every building and the space between every word spoken afterward. And Elias Boone knew it as he stood there a moment longer, his eyes not on the town but on the horizon beyond it, where the land stretched flat and unforgiving for miles, because trouble in the West never stayed in one place. It traveled, slow sometimes, quiet most of the time, but always moving. And the woman beside him shifted her weight carefully, testing her balance not just with her legs, but with her breath, with her will. And when she took a step forward on her own, small but certain, It said more than anything the town had witnessed that morning, and Elias finally turned slightly toward her, his voice low enough that only she could hear as he asked her name. Not because he needed it to understand who she was, but because names carried weight. They made things real in a way silence never could, and she held his gaze for a moment before answering. Nayeli. The words settling between them like something older than either of them, and Elias nodded once, as if confirming something he had already known deep down, and asked her where she was headed before all of this had found her. And she looked past him, toward the edge of town, toward the long road that cut through the land like a scar that never healed, and said she had been trying to reach Red Mesa, that there were people there who needed to hear something, something that could not be trusted to the wrong hands. And as she spoke, her fingers brushed lightly against the pendant at her throat, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in recognition of what it represented. And Elias followed that movement with his eyes, understanding now that the small piece of silver carried more than memory. It carried purpose, and purpose in a place like this was never simple, never without consequence. And behind them, Sheriff Doyle Mercer watched quietly, no longer the center of the moment, but not entirely removed from it either. A man who had seen enough to know that what had just happened would ripple outward whether he liked it or not. And he stepped forward just enough to be heard without interrupting, telling Elias that the road to Red Mesa was not as empty as it used to be, that there had been talk, riders moving through at night, people asking questions that did not belong to ordinary travelers, and Elias listened without turning, because warnings were part of the land. You learned to hear them without letting them decide for you. And Nayeli's expression did not change, not at the mention of danger, not at the thought of what might be waiting ahead. Only her posture shifted slightly, stronger now, more grounded, as if the moment in the street had not broken her, but clarified something inside her instead. And Elias let out a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he understands that the choice in front of him is not really a choice at all, and he adjusted his stance, glancing once more toward the open land beyond Dry Creek, then back to Nayeli. And in that quiet space between them, something unspoken settled into place. Not a promise, not yet, but the beginning of one. And without another word, he stepped forward, not away from the town, not entirely toward it either, but alongside her, matching her pace as she took another careful step. And together they moved toward the edge of Dry Creek, where the dust gave way to open ground, and whatever waited beyond had already begun to close the distance. The edge of Dry Creek came up slowly, not marked by any sign or gate. Just the way the buildings thinned out and the hard-packed street gave way to open dirt that stretched toward the horizon, and the sound of the town faded behind them, replaced by wind moving steady across the land, carrying dust and the faint scent of sun-warmed earth. And Elias Boone walked beside Nayeli without crowding her. His pace matched to hers, not out of caution but respect, because a person finding their balance again did not need to be hurried. And for a while neither of them spoke, letting the silence settle into something easier, something that did not demand explanation. And it was Nayeli who broke it first, her voice quiet but steady as she asked him why he had stepped forward back there when every other man had chosen to stay still. And Elias took a few more steps before answering, his eyes on the distant line where sky met land, saying that sometimes a man does not step forward because he wants to, but because he remembers what it feels like when no one else does. And that answer seemed to rest between them without needing more, because some truths did not need to be stretched thin with too many words. And after a moment she nodded slightly, as if that was enough, and her hand rose briefly to touch the pendant at her throat again, the silver catching light with each step. And Elias noticed the way she held it now, not like a fragile thing, but like something that had already proven it could endure. And he asked her what exactly waited in Red Mesa that made the journey worth the risk. Sheriff Mercer had hinted at, and she hesitated, not out of fear but careful thought, choosing her words the way someone chooses a path across uncertain ground. And she said there were people there who believed the land was about to change, that lines were being drawn without consent, that agreements made far away were beginning to press down on places like Red Mesa without warning. And she said the message she carried was not written on paper. It lived in memory, passed from voice to voice, because paper could be taken, burned, or twisted, but memory had to be confronted directly. And Elias listened without interruption, because that kind of burden could not be shared lightly. and he understood enough of the world to know that when words traveled without ink, they carried weight that could not be ignored, and the wind picked up slightly, brushing against them as they walked, and ahead the land opened wider, revealing the long trail that would take them miles beyond anything familiar. And Elias slowed just a fraction, glancing back once toward Dry Creek, now smaller behind them, already beginning to feel like a place that belonged to another moment. And when he turned forward again, his expression had settled into something firm, something decided, and Nayeli saw it, though he had not spoken yet, and she asked him quietly if he intended to come with her all the way to Red Mesa, because the road ahead would not offer the kind of choices the town had, and Elias let out a slow breath, not heavy, not reluctant, just certain, and said that roads like this did not usually give a man a second chance to choose once he had taken the first step, and that he had already crossed that line back in the street. And for a moment they walked in silence again. But it was a different silence now, not uncertain, not searching, but shared, and somewhere far ahead, beyond the next rise of land where the trail disappeared from view, a faint movement stirred along the horizon, too distant to make out clearly, but enough to suggest that the road to Red Mesa was not as empty as it seemed. And without slowing, without turning away, Elias Boone and Nayeli continued forward, each step carrying them deeper into something neither of them would be able to walk back from. The land beyond the rise did not reveal itself all at once. It unfolded slowly with each step, like something deciding whether it wanted to be seen, and Elias Boone narrowed his eyes slightly as that faint movement along the horizon became just clear enough to recognize as riders. Not many, maybe 3 or 4 at most. But out here numbers did not always tell the full story, and he did not stop walking, did not point or call attention to it, because panic traveled faster than truth, and he had no intention of inviting either. And beside him Nayeli had already seen them too, her posture shifting in a way that most people would miss, but not him, her shoulders settling lower, her steps more measured, like someone who understood that being watched was not the same as being threatened, not yet. And the wind carried between them, steady and dry, brushing against their clothes and carrying with it the faint sound of hooves striking distant ground. And after a few more yards Elias spoke quietly, not turning his head, asking how often the road to Red Mesa was followed by shadows like that. And Nayeli answered without hesitation, saying that lately it had become more common, not because people were curious, but because someone had begun to care too much about who moved across this land and why. And Elias let that settle, because interest like that never came without a reason, and reasons out here were rarely simple. And the riders ahead shifted slightly, angling their path just enough to confirm what Elias already suspected, that they were not passing through by chance. They were adjusting, watching, measuring distance the same way he was, and still he kept his pace steady, neither slowing nor quickening, because there was a kind of language and movement, and he intended to speak it clearly. And Nayeli's hand brushed the pendant again, not out of habit this time, but as if grounding herself to something deeper. And she said quietly that if those riders had been sent, then it meant the message she carried was already known to be important. And Elias gave a small nod, because that was the only kind of message anyone bothered to follow. And for a stretch of about 50 yards neither of them spoke again, letting the distance between them and the riders close just enough to make recognition unavoidable. And when the men finally changed direction fully, turning their horses to intercept rather than observe, Elias exhaled slowly, not with tension, but with acceptance, because the road had decided to show its hands sooner than expected, and he adjusted his hat slightly against the sun, his gaze steady as the figures grew clearer, their outlines sharpening against the bright sky. And he said under his breath that whatever happened next would not be decided by who reached Red Mesa first, but by who understood the cost of the journey. And Nayeli glanced at him then, not questioning, not doubting, but measuring him in a way she had not before, as if seeing not just the man who had stepped forward in Dry Creek, but the one who kept walking when the road stopped being simple and the riders approached within 100 yards now, close enough that the details of their posture could be read, not aggressive, not relaxed either, something in between, something deliberate, and the air between both sides tightened, not with fear, but with expectation. And Elias Boone did not reach for his gun, did not raise his voice. He simply kept walking forward, step by step, until the space between them narrowed to a point where silence itself became a choice. And in that moment, with the wind cutting low across the ground and the horizon stretching wide behind them, it became clear that this meeting had been waiting for them long before they ever left Dry Creek. The riders did not rush the meeting, and that alone said more than any drawn weapon ever could, because men who understood the land knew that speed was rarely power, patience was. And as the distance closed to less than 50 yards, the lead rider raised one hand slightly, not as a threat, not as a greeting either, just enough to signal that what came next would be decided by words before anything else. And Elias Boone slowed his pace just a fraction, not stopping, not yielding ground, simply allowing the moment to settle into something balanced. And beside him, Nayeli did the same, her posture calm, her gaze steady, the pendant at her throat catching the light with each quiet breath she took. And when the two sides finally came within speaking distance, the wind carried the sound of leather creaking and horses shifting beneath their riders, a low, constant reminder that nothing out here stayed still for long, and the lead rider studied them carefully, his eyes lingering on Nayeli for a second longer than necessary, before shifting to Elias, measuring, weighing, deciding. And when he spoke, his voice carried the rough edge of someone used to being heard without needing to raise it, asking where they were headed with the kind of tone that suggested he already knew the answer. And Elias did not respond immediately, because questions like that were never about information. They were about control, and control was something he had no intention of giving away. And instead, he let the silence stretch just long enough to make the rider feel it, then answered simply that the road ahead belonged to anyone willing to walk it. And the words hung there, not confrontational, not submissive, just true in a way that could not be easily challenged. And the rider's expression shifted slightly, not anger, not amusement, something closer to recognition, as if he had expected resistance, but not in that form. And behind him, the other riders adjusted in their saddles, not restless, but attentive, their focus narrowing as the conversation took shape. And Nayeli spoke then, her voice calm, but carrying a quiet authority that changed the air between them, saying that she was on her way to Red Mesa, and that her path did not cross theirs unless they chose to make it so. And the lead rider's gaze returned to her, sharper now, more direct, and for a moment it seemed like he might challenge her words, might press further. But instead he exhaled slowly and glanced toward the horizon behind them, as if considering something beyond the immediate moment. And when he looked back, his tone had shifted again, less probing, more certain, as he said that Red Mesa had been drawing attention lately, that people with influence far from this land had begun to take interest in what happened there, and that travelers carrying messages without paper often found themselves followed, not because they had done anything wrong, but because someone feared what they might say when they arrived. And Elias listened without interrupting, because there was truth in that, the kind that did not need to be proven. And the rider continued, saying that the road ahead would not offer many chances to turn back, that once they crossed the next ridge, the land would open wide with no cover and no easy way to disappear, and that not everyone who started that path finished it the way they expected. And the warning settled between them, not heavy, not threatening, just real. And for a moment the only sound was the wind moving across the open ground, carrying dust and slow, shifting patterns around their boots. And then Elias gave a small nod, not in agreement, not in defiance, just acknowledgement, and said that roads like that did not scare him, not because they were easy, but because they were honest. And something in that answer seemed to settle whatever question the rider had been holding on to, because he studied Elias one last time, then shifted his reins slightly, signaling the others without needing to speak. And as the riders began to turn away, the lead man paused just long enough to say that not all who followed the road to Red Mesa would announce themselves so plainly, and that some would not offer warnings at all. And then they were moving again, their figures pulling back into the distance the same way they had appeared, leaving behind nothing but the faint echo of hoofbeats and the knowledge that the path ahead had just become clearer. And as Elias Boone and Nayeli stood there for a moment longer before continuing forward, it was no longer a question of whether they were being watched, but how many others were still waiting beyond the next horizon. The riders disappeared into the horizon the same way they had arrived, leaving behind nothing but a thin line of dust that slowly dissolved into the afternoon air. And for a long moment, Elias Boone did not move, not because he doubted the road ahead, but because he understood that warnings like that were not given lightly, not out here. And beside him, Nayeli watched the same empty stretch of land, her eyes not searching for what had just left, but for what might still be hidden beyond what could be seen. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but quieter now, as if the weight of what they carried had shifted again, saying that those men were not the ones they needed to fear most. That men who spoke plainly often believed in something, even if it was not the same thing she did. And Elias nodded slightly, because he knew the difference, had learned it the hard way years ago, that the most dangerous paths were not marked by those who announced themselves, but by those who stayed silent until the moment mattered. And he took a step forward, then another, letting the rhythm of movement return, because standing still too long out here gave the land time to close in on you. And Nayeli matched his pace, her steps more certain now, not perfect, but grounded. And as they crested the next rise, the world opened wider than before, stretching out in long waves of sunburned earth and scattered brush, the kind of landscape that offered no place to hide and no easy way to change direction once you had committed to it. And Elias scanned it without turning his head, reading the ground the way some men read letters, noticing where the dust had been disturbed, where the wind had shifted patterns that should have remained untouched. And there were signs there, faint but real, tracks that did not belong to the riders who had just left, older, deeper, spaced differently, telling a story that had begun before Elias and Nayeli ever stepped onto this road. And he slowed slightly, enough for Nayeli to notice, and she followed his gaze to the ground, her expression tightening just enough to show she understood what he saw. And she said quietly that they were not alone on this path, not now, not before, and likely not ahead either. And Elias exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that did not carry fear, only acceptance, because the road had made its intentions clear now, and turning back was no longer a question, not after Dry Creek, not after the pendant, not after the way the truth had already begun to move ahead of them. And the sun climbed higher, pressing heat down across the open land, making the air shimmer just enough to blur the edges of distant shapes. And for a moment it became difficult to tell where the land ended and the sky began. And in that shifting horizon, Elias saw something, not clearly, not enough to name, but enough to feel, a presence that did not belong to chance. And Nayeli felt it too, though neither of them spoke it aloud, because some things lost their shape when turned into words too soon. And instead they kept walking, step by step, letting the distance close not just between them and Red Mesa, but between them and whatever waited in that open stretch ahead. And after a while Nayeli spoke again, asking Elias if he ever wondered whether the road chose the traveler or the traveler chose the road. And he let out a faint breath that might have been a quiet laugh if it carried more sound, saying that it usually started as one and ended as the other, and that somewhere along the way it stopped mattering which came first. And she nodded slightly at that, her fingers brushing the pendant again, not for comfort, but as if measuring the distance between what had been and what was coming. And the wind shifted once more, carrying with it a sound that did not belong to empty land, something distant, rhythmic, almost like movement held just beyond sight. And Elias Boone did not slow this time, did not hesitate, because whatever was out there had already begun to move toward them. And the only thing left now was to meet it before it decided how the story would be told. The sound carried longer this time, not lost in the wind, not softened by distance, but steady, deliberate, like something that had chosen its rhythm and refused to break it. And Elias Boone slowed just enough to listen without appearing to, his head still forward, his eyes scanning the shimmer of heat that blurred the horizon into something uncertain. And beside him Nayeli did the same, her breathing even, her steps measured, but her focus sharper now, tuned to the same unseen presence that pressed quietly against the edges of the moment. And the land ahead seemed to hold its breath, the dry grass barely moving, the scattered rocks casting thin shadows that stretched like fingers across the ground. And then it appeared, not all at once, but in pieces, a flicker of motion behind a low ridge, a shape resolving where there had been none before. And Elias narrowed his gaze slightly, recognizing the pattern not as a single rider or even a small group, but something broader, something spread out with intention. And he exhaled slowly, because this was not coincidence. This was design. And Nayeli spoke under her breath, not asking, not guessing, but confirming what she already understood, that whoever waited ahead had known they were coming long before they reached this stretch of land. And Elias gave a faint nod, because roads like this did not create encounters, they revealed them. And as they moved closer, the shapes clarified into men positioned across the rise, not blocking the path entirely, but enough to make direction a choice rather than a given. And there was no shouting, no sudden movement, just a presence that asked a question without speaking it. And Elias adjusted his stride slightly, angling just enough to show he was not turning away, but also not charging forward, because there was a balance in these moments that could not be forced. And Nayeli stayed beside him, her posture upright now, fully steady. The weakness from earlier replaced by something deeper, something that did not rely on strength alone. And her hand rested lightly near the pendant, not holding it, not needing to, just aware of it. And as the distance closed to less than 70 yards, one of the figures stepped forward, not quickly, not aggressively, just enough to separate himself from the others. And even from that distance, Elias could see the difference in how he carried himself, not like a man eager to prove something, but like one who already knew where he stood. And the wind shifted again, carrying a faint scent of smoke and leather, and with it came a voice, calm, measured, asking them to stop where they were, not as an order, but as a request that expected to be honored. And Elias came to a halt, not abruptly, just a natural end to his step, and Nayeli stopped with him, the two of them standing in the open with nothing between them and the line of men ahead but distance and intention. And for a moment no one moved, the silence stretching wide across the land. And then the man ahead spoke again, asking what message was worth this kind of journey. What words could carry enough weight to draw attention from places far beyond Red Mesa? And Elias did not answer, because the question was not meant for him. And Nayeli took a slow breath, stepping forward half a pace, not to challenge, not to retreat, but to meet the moment as it was. And when she spoke, her voice carried across the distance without strain, saying that some messages were not meant to be owned, not meant to be stopped, and that the land itself had a way of deciding who would carry them and who would try to silence them. And the man ahead listened, his posture unchanged, but something in the air shifted. Again, subtle, almost invisible, like the first sign of a storm that had not yet broken. And Elias Boone stood there beside her, saying nothing, because he understood now that this was no longer about reaching Red Mesa. It was about whether the truth they carried would be allowed to keep moving, or whether it would be forced to stand still right here in the open where the land offered no shelter and no easy answers. The wind moved between them like it was listening, carrying Nayeli's words across the open ground and letting them settle where they needed to, not rushed, not forced. And the man ahead did not answer right away, which told Elias Boone more than any quick reply ever could, because men who rushed to speak were often trying to fill silence, but men who let it stand were weighing something heavier, something that could not be undone once chosen. And the line of riders behind him remained still, not restless, not tense, just present in a way that suggested they were not waiting for a command so much as for a decision. And Elias shifted his weight slightly, not as a threat, not even as preparation, just enough to remind himself that standing still was also a choice. And beside him, Nayeli did not step back, did not lower her gaze. She simply held her ground with the kind of calm that came from knowing exactly what she carried and why it mattered. And after a long moment, the man ahead took a slow breath and stepped forward another pace, closing the distance just enough to make his voice clearer without raising it. And he said that the land did not belong to the loudest voice or the strongest hand. It belonged to those who understood its cost, and that too many men had begun to forget that. And his eyes moved briefly to Elias, not as a challenge, but as a question, as if asking whether he understood that cost or was simply walking beside it. And Elias met that look without hesitation, because he had seen enough of the West to know that the land never gave anything freely. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but steady, saying that cost was not something a man talked about. It was something he carried whether he wanted to or not. And the words settled between them, not heavy, not light, just real. And something in the air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like a door opening without sound. And the man ahead glanced once toward Nayeli's pendant, the silver catching the light even from that distance. And his expression changed just slightly, not softened, but clarified, as if a piece of the story had finally come into focus. And he said that messages like the one she carried did not travel alone. They drew attention because they threatened something already in motion, and that stopping them was not always about power. Sometimes it was about fear of what came next. And Nayeli listened without interrupting, her posture unchanged, and when she answered, her voice held no anger, no defiance, only a quiet certainty that did not ask permission to exist, saying that fear had already taken enough from the land, that it had shaped decisions made far away and forced them onto people who never had a voice in them, and that the message she carried was not meant to challenge, but to remind. And for a moment no one spoke again, the silence stretching wide across the open ground. And then the man ahead exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just a fraction, not in surrender, but in acceptance of something he could not ignore, and he stepped aside, not dramatically, not even fully, just enough to open the path that had been held uncertain moments before, and the riders behind him shifted with him, creating a space that had not existed a second ago. And Elias Boone did not move right away, because moments like that required more than action. They required understanding, and he glanced once at Nayeli, seeing the same recognition in her eyes. And then he stepped forward, one measured step into the space that had been given, and she moved with him, not following, not leading, but walking beside him. And as they passed through the line of men, the wind carried a different sound now, not warning, not tension, but something quieter, something that felt like the land itself had made a choice. And behind them the riders remained where they stood, not turning, not calling out, simply watching as Elias Boone and Nayeli continued toward Red Mesa, carrying with them not just a message, but the weight of every decision that had allowed them to keep walking forward. The path beyond the riders felt different, not safer, not easier, but clearer in a way that only came after something had been tested and allowed to pass. And Elias Boone did not look back as they continued forward, because whatever had stood behind them had already made its choice. And the land ahead now carried a different kind of silence, one that did not question their presence, but acknowledged it. And Nayeli walked with steadier steps than before, not because the road had softened, but because something inside her had settled, something that no longer needed to brace itself against every moment. And the pendant at her throat moved gently with each breath, catching the late afternoon light in brief flashes that seemed almost like signals, though neither of them spoke of it. And the ground began to rise again, slow and steady, leading them toward a ridge that stretched across the horizon like a quiet boundary between what had been and what was coming. And as they climbed, the wind shifted direction, cooler now, carrying with it the faint scent of distant water and wood smoke, a sign that they were nearing something lived in, something real. And when they reached the top of the ridge, the land opened before them in a way that neither of them paused to admire, because the sight was not one of beauty alone, it was one of meaning. Red Mesa spread out below in quiet layers of earth and structure, low buildings shaped by time and necessity, smoke rising in thin lines from a handful of places, and movement visible in small, steady patterns that spoke of a community already aware of more than it revealed. And Elias took a slow breath, not in relief, but in recognition, because places like this did not exist by accident. They endured. And Nayeli stopped for just a moment, her eyes scanning the settlement, not searching for danger, but for connection. And when she spoke, her voice carried something softer now, not weakened, but grounded in familiarity, saying that this was where the message needed to be heard, not shouted, not forced, but spoken in the way it was meant to be carried. And Elias nodded once, understanding that the journey had not been about reaching this place alone. It had been about arriving with the truth intact. And as they began the descent toward Red Mesa, the air seemed to shift again, not with tension, but with awareness, as if the land itself recognized their arrival and adjusted accordingly. And figures began to emerge from the edges of the settlement, not rushing, not alarmed, but attentive, watching the approach with the kind of quiet focus that came from experience. And among them an older man stepped forward slightly, his posture calm, his presence steady, and though he said nothing at first, his eyes moved from Nayeli to Elias and back again, taking in not just who they were, but what they carried between them. and Naeli slowed her steps as they drew closer, her hand rising once more to rest lightly against the pendant, not out of habit, but as acknowledgement. And when she reached a distance where words could carry without strain, she spoke, her voice clear, not raised, but strong enough to reach those who needed to hear it, saying that she had come with what had been entrusted to her, that the path had not been simple, but it had not been broken either. And the older man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his eyes holding something deeper than curiosity, something closer to recognition. And after a long moment, he nodded slowly, not in surprise, but in acceptance of something he had been expecting all along. And he stepped aside just enough to open the space behind him, a quiet invitation rather than a command. And Elias Boone felt it then, not as relief, but as a shift in weight, because the road had led them here, but it had not ended. It had simply changed form. And as Naeli stepped forward into Red Mesa, Elias moved beside her without hesitation, because whatever came next was no longer about standing in a single moment. It was about what would be said, and who would be willing to listen when the truth was finally spoken in a place that had been waiting for it all along. The settlement did not erupt with questions or noise when Naeli stepped forward. It absorbed her presence the way the land absorbs rain, quietly, completely, and the people of Red Mesa gathered not in a rush but in a slow, deliberate way, forming a circle that was not meant to surround, but to witness. And Elias Boone stood just behind her shoulder, not leading, not shielding, simply present in the way he had been since Dry Creek. And the older man who had stepped aside now moved to stand opposite her, his eyes steady, his posture relaxed but attentive. And when Naeli spoke again, her voice did not carry urgency. It carried weight, the kind that comes from knowing that what is said next cannot be taken back. And she began not with warning, not with accusation, but with memory, speaking of agreements made without the land being asked, of lines drawn by hands that had never walked the ground they claimed to understand. And as she spoke, the circle remained still, not interrupting, not reacting in obvious ways, but listening with the kind of focus that turned words into something tangible. And Elias felt it then, the shift that had been building since the moment he saw the pendant in the dust. This was where the journey had been leading, not to conflict, not to confrontation, but to a moment where truth could exist without being forced to fight for space. And Naeli's hand rested lightly against the silver at her throat as she continued, explaining that what was coming would not arrive with noise or warning, but with quiet decisions made far away that would ripple outward until places like Red Mesa were expected to change without being asked. And when she finished, she did not step back, did not lower her gaze. She simply stood, letting the silence hold what had been said. And the older man watched her for a long moment before nodding slowly, his expression unchanged but his eyes carrying a depth that spoke of understanding far older than the moment itself. And he turned then, not to dismiss her words, but to face the people gathered. And in that simple movement, the weight of what she had carried was passed forward, not lost, not diminished, but shared. And one by one others in the circle began to shift, not in disagreement, not in fear, but in recognition, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud to be real. And Elias Boone remained where he stood, his role complete in a way that did not require acknowledgement, because he had not brought the message. He had simply made sure it reached where it needed to go. And Naeli lowered her hand from the pendant, her shoulders easing just slightly, not from relief, but from the knowledge that the road behind her had not been wasted. And as the light of the setting sun stretched long across Red Mesa, casting everything in a warm, steady glow, the land seemed to settle into a quiet that felt earned, not given. And Elias finally turned his gaze toward the horizon they had crossed, the distance now softened by time and light. And he understood something then that the road had been trying to teach all along, that standing with someone was not about changing the outcome. It was about making sure the truth had a chance to be seen. And as he stepped back half a pace, giving Naeli the space that was now hers to hold, the wind moved gently through the settlement, carrying no warning, no tension, only the quiet presence of a story that had found its place. And out here, where words often failed and silence carried more weight than any promise, that was the closest thing to justice the land had ever known.